family series this year was Improving Your Serve. And how do you really improve your serve? How do you become a servant leader on the family court of life? And so it's been a great time and a great opportunity together. And a few weeks ago, I got a phone call from our chaplain, Rick Braswell, who said that he had the opportunity to have one of America's great heroes that is in town. I had the privilege of hearing this man as a hero when I was a young minister in Oklahoma City years ago. And when I had the opportunity to say, that we could have this gentleman and his wife here with us today, I said, absolutely. It'll tie in perfectly with what we're doing as far as serving and the importance of serving. And I want to tell you a little bit about my guest today, because I do want you to know, whether you're here in person or whether you're watching by our webcast today, whether it's here in the United States or any part of the world and listening in your own language, I want you to know it's going to be a great treat for you today to hear one of the most compelling stories you've ever heard. Let me just give you a little bit of background as I introduce my guest today. Patrick Cleve McClary was raised on a 10,000-acre farm in South Carolina. As a matter of fact, he grew up hunting and fishing and playing sports like a lot of guys do. He excelled in sports. He was a great athlete in high school and later a great athlete in college, and was really studying to be a coach, and was in graduate school coaching at the time, and had fallen in love with a young woman that had really captured his heart. And they were set to be married on March the 26th in 1967. And while he was on that college campus as a coach there in graduate school at college campus, he looked out his window one day during the Vietnam War time, and he saw a protest going on. He saw students burning an American flag, and immediately something happened in his own life and in his heart. And Cleve went, resigned from his coaching responsibilities, signed up at the Marine Enlistment Center, and they sent him to officers training school in Quantico. And there he became an officer, a lieutenant, and he was given a battalion, a reconnaissance battalion. And he had to leave his young bride and go to Vietnam. And there he began to make reconnaissance missions in the jungles of Vietnam. He had made 18, and he was on his 19th reconnaissance mission, and it would be his last mission before he was going to have some time for furlough. And while there, as you'll read in his book, he encountered the enemy in hand-to-hand combat. In that hand-to-hand combat with his reconnaissance battalion, he lost his eye and his left arm. As a matter of fact, one quote that I read from a military general said, "We have absolutely no idea other than to say it was miraculous that this man was able to survive and to bring out the men that did not die in that attack home with him." He would come back to the United States. He would be in the hospital for the next 2 years. He would have 34 surgeries. And yet in the midst of that time, since that time, has become one of the greatest spokespersons for his faith, his commitment to Jesus Christ, his unbelievable love for his country, and also a life partner. Talk about family. Married this young beauty queen from South Carolina, and now after 42 years of marriage, have an amazing testimony of God's grace and what it really takes to improve your serve on the family court. Family at First Baptist Church of Fort Lauderdale, this is going to be a day you'll never forget. Join with me as we welcome a real American hero, Lieutenant Cleve McClary and his wife, Deanna. Bless you. Thank you, sir. Bless you. Have a seat. That's yours?
Might need some water.
I'll get you some.
Oh, the old?
Yeah. Wow.
God bless you. I tell you, what an absolute delight and joy it is to have you as our guest today, Cleve and Deanna. I am so thankful. And before we even start the interview process, I just want to tell you how much this is. You talk about an old book. This is one of the first printings of Living Proof. But your book, Living Proof, has been reprinted I don't know how many times. And Deanna's book, Commitment to Love, what a great, great story this is. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But I just want to tell you guys just a word about this because I just found out about this. These books will be available. As a matter of fact, Cleve and Deanna will be autographing these at our bookstore today, immediately following the worship service. Now, let me tell you what they do. They take all the proceeds from these books and they give them free to all of the wounded warriors that come home, that are in the hospital, that come home to be with us. Thank you for that ministry. What a phenomenal ministry that is.
Give them out while they're going over, too, when we're speaking to them head
down. Oh, that is great. That is great. Well, tell me a little bit about that. Tell me, you give them out not only when they come back to the hospital.
Well, Cleve and I have been traveling around the country, Okinawa, visiting our troops as they deploy. We were last year in Okinawa, or year before last in Okinawa, when the 3rd Marine Division, they were shipping out for their 3rd tour of duty. And we always give these out. We give Cleve's book, my book, and Psalms and Proverbs.
Wow.
And Cleve's renamed that book, Semper Fi, because God's Word is always faithful. So we want them to have a copy of the Psalms and Proverbs they can read every day. Cleve may mention that. And we were in one big chapel full of Marines. And as we sat there, Brother Larry, I looked out and I said, well, we'll go give y'all all of you all 3 books. But now if you're having marital problems, this kind of fits in with what you're doing. If you're having marital problems, we also want to send a copy of Commitment to Love to your spouse. I said, so come to the back of the chapel and fill out the little legal pad. 80. Wow. 80 filled out that they were not only having marital problems, but 80 of those spouses had already filed for divorce, and many of them had already found new boyfriends. Yeah. So they're going in harm's way with the family front broken. Yes.
You know, I can tell, Cleve, by you and Deanna, I can tell every time I've seen anything on YouTube or read how important that family unit is. And, you know, I just want to begin right there, Cleve. If I could just ask you a question on this whole series. We've been talking about the importance of serving and be a servant leader. And can you talk to us a little bit about what was it about your life that so ignited that kind of passion? You have this beautiful young bride that is a beauty queen, and you've got everything going for you. You've reached the level of you want to achieve in not only your sports but your profession. You're at a college campus, you're a coach, and all of a sudden life changes just like that.
Well, I just always wanted to serve my country, and nobody had really served since the war between the states. Granddaddy and Daddy had become between wars and all, but it's something I always wanted to do, and I wanted to do it when I finished high school, but Dad wanted me to get a college education. I had some scholarships, and also I made that choice. But I really had second thoughts about getting married and leaving a young bride and going overseas. I didn't plan on getting wounded or killed or anything like that, but you never know. But I'm glad I did, because I know God had a purpose and a plan for my life. He does for everybody's life. But if I hadn't had Deanna to give me a warning.
The turning point, though, was when you saw the young man burn the flag. That was a real catalyst, because I thought he'd lost his mind, quite frankly.
Yeah, well,
I wasn't patriotic then.
That's what joined. But getting back to the reason I think that I made it through, like I say, God has a purpose and a plan for our lives. But if I hadn't had a wife to give me a want to come home to, I'd be dead today. I'd have given up. When I shot a suicide guy coming up at me, and he fell in a punji pit with me, exploded, and we blown out. And when I was going through there, I think I hollered out, "Oh God, not me." I mean, I live a pretty good life. I don't do this, I don't do that. I'm better than that guy. But Deanna gave me a want to and a will to live, and helped me survive that.
Wow.
But when he volunteered, I will say, and I know a lot of wives probably understand this, when he said, "Honey, I'm joining the Marine Corps," I thought, wait a minute, you're going to coach, you've got a perfectly great career ahead, we're going to get married. I thought, does he not love me? And he really did. When he saw somebody burn a flag, he said, I know I cannot be deferred to get my master's degree and to teach school and to coach, and these men are dying. You know, I want to serve. Well,
Wow.
I literally called all of his college professors, called the preacher, called everybody to talk some sense into my husband. And now a lot of people say, well, would you change anything? No, I would never change a thing. And we've talked about that, because what I've learned through that, Pastor Larry, I took my freedom for granted. I took every freedom that the veterans had paid for my freedom totally for granted.
Wow.
And I mean, I never really understood until you go to a hospital and you see limbless guys so desperately injured, and you walk in there and you realize I took everything for granted, and never again will I do that. I thank every veteran. We try to hug them and bring them into our home. We just had several that were injured in Iraq and Afghanistan in our home, and I tell you, never ever again will I take that freedom for granted.
Wow.
Thank you.
Cleve, let me ask you, when you did see students burning the American flag, and I recognize that the commentators will tell us all the time that is a right we have. It grieves my heart to see that happen. But what was it about your family growing up that ignited so much loyalty and passion? You guys had been married only how long?
6 months
Yeah.
when he
6
went to
months.
Vietnam.
Yeah, and yet that kind of commitment to totally change a whole life and immediately become an officer in the United States Marine Corps.
I had a great dad, and you talk about rights, but my dad taught me about responsibility. And I think that's what we need in this country today. We got responsibility. And world doesn't know you a living, doesn't know you a job, a career, or an education, but you got to be responsible to work for it and achieve it. And our freedom's not free. You're going to have to pay a price for it. And I think that's a responsibility that we have.
Yeah,
I
God bless
like
you.
what you said about kids flat feet or no feet, they should say
Yeah.
at some point. That's true.
Cleve, I know that you have probably been asked this, thousands of times, and I can't even imagine, it has to be somewhat painful to go back and revisit that. But would you explain to us what happened on that 19th reconnaissance mission?
Well, we're in an area that very few people have been, and had a recon team and set in on a hill, and a suicide squad hit us that night. And like I said earlier, I shot a guy right in front of me, fell in a hole with me, and going through there, I reached back for my shotgun, realized my arm was gone. I had a young black Marine jump on a grenade right next to me and blow himself in half to save my life, and a couple of other Marines came up and helped pick the enemy off and protect us. And helicopter pilots risked their life that night many times and came in. We started getting wounded about midnight, and about almost daylight they got into us and put my dead and wounded on one bird, and as it lifted, the next one landed. And as it lifted, about 150 enemy just covered the hill. So about 5 more minutes we wouldn't have been there. But my men did a great job and put up a good fight. And like I say, I think God had a purpose and a plan for my life to get me off that hill.
How many men did you have with that? It was 19 or 20?
It was 12 with me. I had 2 dead and 8 wounded out of 13 of us.
13.
Wow. 13.
Total of 13 of us.
And talk
with me.
about the sovereign will of God. The helicopter pilots were flying. We've met the chopper pilots. They were actually going to another patrol, heard their plea, because his radio man, it was his first patrol, and he was hit on the initial attack and was killed.
Wow.
So the choppers realized they were desperate and had been left out there basically for 3 days, socked in.
Yes.
So it had to clear enough for them to come in, and they knew that entire team was going to be wiped out if they didn't go in. And I'm telling you, it was amazing. And we have found out that the 3 that died that night, Ralph, right there, precious young man that used to send me CDs, what do you call those, old-fashioned tapes, and used to
Cassettes.
send me poetry. And then Tom Jennings from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, a young 19-year-old Marine, died that night. And then they didn't expect Cleve to live. But we found out the 3 that died that night were prepared for eternity. They were ready to meet the Lord Jesus, and Cleve was not ready to meet the Lord Jesus.
Wow.
So we truly know
Amazing.
His sovereign will.
He is sovereign.
That's right.
Cleve, let me ask you about this young man, this Private First Class Ralph Johnson. This young man saw the grenade by you after you had been wounded and fell on that to save your life?
it was dark, and we had flares, and things light up and all quite a bit. And you sound like Congress when they write him up, and he later got the Congressional Medal of Honor, or his family did. But they were asking, said, did he really mean to do it, or did he just fall on it? And I said, well, I can't answer that. I can't for me. I'd have been getting out of there. But all I know, he ended up on it, and we're alive because of him. And that's why we wrote him up.
Have you had a
for
chance to visit with his family since
yes,
then?
we've been with his family. His mother went home with the Lord just a few years ago. She was a great lady. He had 19 brothers and sisters. A lot of those have had some problems.
And his sister's still at the VA
his
in
sister's
Charleston as a
volunteers
volunteer.
for the VA in Charleston, and the hospital in Charleston, VA, has been named after Ralph now, and so we appreciate that.
But the amazing thing about that night is his radio man that had been on 18 patrols with Cleve left him back in base area because Cleve was going to be the best man in his wedding. And he did not want Corporal Munoz, to go out on the patrol because Cleve knew it was a risky patrol. He volunteered for that patrol. And we know the man who's a colonel now that Cleve took his patrol. So they flip-flop. Military understand that.
Yeah.
I've learned all this. But for 30-something years, that radio man has lived with survivor's guilt. And that's a lot of these young guys coming back from Iraq are struggling with survivor's guilt because a good friend was killed and they're left alive and they think he was so great, why was he? So they're questioning so much. And after 35 years, Cleve and I were speaking, and this shows you how important a spouse is, how important a wife is, not to compete with her husband, to help complete her husband.
Yes.
I've heard his story all these years. We were in Petaluma, California, speaking of the Coast Guard, and we invited Barbara and Munoz over. That night I said, Munoz, you've never struggled with all this PTSD and survivor's guilt. He said, oh, yes, I have. Ever since that night, I should have been on that patrol with the lieutenant, and things would have been different. That day, I watched the radio man literally shadow Cleve, like he was attached to him, like a Siamese twin on that boat. I thought, this is what it looks like in combat. I'd never really seen that. And that night, as he said, yes, I've struggled with it for 35 years. I've been going for counseling. I just should have been there with him that night. And they started talking about the patrol, and I had never heard Cleve say this as he taught. He said, Lieutenant, where was your radio man? He said, Munoz, I didn't know my radio man. So he dug in beside me with Jennings and Johnson, but he said, there was a punji pit that I cleared that it was like granite. He said, had you been with me that night, you'd have been there beside me because they knew each other. They were so close. And they went on talking, and all of a sudden I said, well, you know what? Can I just show you the sovereignty of God? I've just seen the sovereignty of God in your life. He said, well, I don't understand. I said, Munoz, I'm not a rocket scientist or an engineer. But had you been in that punji pit with Cleve that night when that Viet Cong suicide guy fell in the punji pit, it was big enough for two.
Yeah.
It literally blew Cleve out of there and through the air. That's when he realized his arm was gone. Had Munoz been there, side by side, the guy would have fallen between them and both of them would have died. I said, things would have been different. So let's say God's ways are far better than your ways, and that is the sovereignty of God.
That's a great word. That's a great word. Cleve, one of the things that, thank you, just hang on just a second. I have so many questions. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about that I loved in your book was the fact that on several of the missions you did capture some enemy and you brought them back to POW camps. And I love, as I was reading the book, one of the things you said, we never tortured them. You hear a lot today about how terrible America is, but you state in your book that at one point the Viet Cong even went into the POW camp and freed their prisoners, and their prisoners refused to go with them. Now, that doesn't sound like they were really treated real bad to me.
No, that's true. You take care of them, and so they would fight or work with whoever would support them and give them help. And a lot of times the communists came through and just slaughtered them during the nights and all, and threatened their family. But if you treat people right, and they'll respond right, and I think that's what we need to do.
Now, Cleve, when you recognized that this suicide bomber had detonated this bomb, and you lost your arm and you lost your eye, and you state in the book that you actually laid there and pretended you were dead, and how long after that happened did it take for them to rescue you guys?
I don't remember writing that in the book. I kept my men fighting and kept going and just encouraged them. If I had laid there and pretended dead, I'd be dead. They would
Well, you know, I
overrun
was
us.
probably dressing the story up a little bit and rewriting it.
No. That's what you can't do. You got to keep fighting and you got to keep encouraging them and returning fire. And
Well, tell them about your corpsman. That's a very good example.
but Corman was blind and deaf for a while, so he was there
called
next to
gross
me.
stress.
Gross
Well,
stress.
how did you, with those types of injuries, how were you able to even function at
I
that?
think just God gave me the strength and just adrenaline and just to keep going. But I knew you had to keep people coming and fighting and returning fire, because as soon as you lay there, it's all over.
Yeah, wow. One of the things that we've talked about in this series, Deanna, is how important it is to fight for your family. You guys are a phenomenal couple that have seen life just absolutely turn on a dime. The book says that you guys experienced 34 surgeries. Now, was that over a 2-year period, or did that?
About 40 now.
Now about 40.
It's 40.
But anyway, about 2.5-year period.
Yeah. As a young bride, how did you even pick up the pieces and begin to say, all right, this is life? Because honestly, in this society, it'd be easy just to walk away.
Well, I really believe as I look back at my life and I realize I had some tough times in my childhood. We had the things that people thought made a home. We had all the external things, nice house. Daddy was the administrator of a medical center and a pharmacy, and Daddy had an alcohol problem that some parts of my life were very dismal. And that's why I love Habakkuk, because it talks about the trials in chapter 3, verse 17, the depressing, despondent, discouraging times. I'd gone through so much adversity in building me. That's why I never look back and say, I wish I had this. I wish I could have had that. I am so thankful for my dad and what I learned through adversity, preparing me, and a mother who taught me about commitment to love when Daddy was so unlovely that people were saying, leave him, Caroline, leave him. She stayed. She let me realize what tough love looks like. And that was a preparation of me seeing at an early age what commitment looked like. And when I walked in that hospital, literally seeing Cleve for the first time, I just thanked the Lord that He had had me change my major to nursing. I was studying prosthetics and amputees when I got the telegram telling me about Cleve. Now, I didn't know that Cleve was even going to make it, because every telegram was getting worse. I mean, each day his left eye's blown out, the next day his left leg may have to be amputated, gangrene. It was always getting worse, and they told me they would tell me everything on the initial telegram, but they didn't. Finally, I wish now I'd gone to Japan. I really do. I wish I could have been there with him, but because I've talked to a young woman that just got back from going to see her husband after he was so injured. Where was she?
I went to Germany.
Yeah, I went to Germany, and I wish I could have done that because he needed me there. But they said we might be crossing the ocean at the same time, so I had to wait. And that was the longest part of it all, waiting.
Wow.
And they prepared me. I remember the next day when Cleve's mom and I finally were allowed to fly to Bethesda. They flew Cleve back from Japan. We were all going to meet for that first time. They wouldn't let us see him that night because he was too weak. The next day we rode up the elevator to the hospital. My heart was pounding, as it is now. The elevator doors opened and the doctors were there waiting. They were literally waiting for me at Bethesda. And I looked at them and I thought they were going to tell me Cleve had died because they were there. And I thought, why else would they be here? And they saw the look on my face. They said, he's alive, but we have to prepare you for the initial shock. We have to tell you what your husband looks like before you ever walk into his room. Your reaction to him this day is vitally important to his recovery. Etched in my mind forever.
Wow.
And then I heard Cleve's voice, that southern low country voice. It was muffled. I didn't know why. I said, that's my husband. Please let me go to his room. And I knew I'd spent almost every night since the telegram with his mom and dad, and I just hear her walk through the house, just beating her hands together and just crying. And I knew she was not ready to see her only son in that condition. I knew that. She later told me, had I not been the first one in that room, she could not have gone in there. It was so unreal. And I walked down, literally magnetized by his voice. Got to the end room, and there he was. Unbelievable sight.
Wow. Cleve, let me ask you, because that had to be a lot of anxiety on your heart seeing Deanna for the first time. Of course, you might have been in so much pain, you weren't even remembering that. But do you have any recollection of that first visit?
Oh, yeah, I sure do. And I was wondering how she would react, and I thought on you, but you just never know. And she's right there and never changed and never left me. And boy, she gave me everything in the world to live for.
Cleve's mom and dad both said that they weren't sure at 19 if I was going to be able to. They literally said and talked about it, we hope she will stay, but we're not sure. They didn't know how I'd react, and they weren't sure how they were going to handle this son with all of these injuries. So the Lord really worked that out. And when I walked into his room, I will say, and that's what we tell young people when we go in the hospital now. Cleve and I recently left Walter Reed, and we visited all these troops with unbelievable injuries.
Yes.
And there was this one young man, he'd lost both legs. His attitude was so bad, he had his little earphones on that you could hear the rock music blasting, and we tried to talk to him, but he just kind of turned like, leave me alone. So we went to the young man in the bed next and talked to him, gracious young man. Cleve prayed with him. As we were walking out, Cleve knew this young man had just turned his back on us, so we weren't going to talk. And this is where the Lord has given me a holy boldness. In the same way in that hospital.
You know what? I hadn't noticed that.
I walked up to him, I took his little headphones off. I said, let me tell you something, you're a nice looking young man. And yes, you've got some challenges with no legs there, but I got news for you. The biggest challenge you've got is your attitude. Sorry you missed talking to us because we wanted to share with you. Well, I mean, I know that seems brutal, Brother Alan, but let me tell you, it was really important because as we left, I knew I was going to go back in that room.
Yes.
But I didn't have to. He got out of that bed, into his wheelchair, came down the hall and said, ma'am, I'm sorry, you're right. And he said, I want to thank you. The doctors and the nurses there were shocked because they've been trying to get him out of the bed because you can't get out of the bed to get help if you're not willing to listen. And that's what a lot of these Marines today just need to know. Somebody cares enough, and sometimes it takes a mama to tell them.
Cleve, now.
And Pastor Larry, I called you Larry.
No, that's fine. Cleve, now I know why you were healed. You were afraid not to get better.
You're right about that.
I'm going to tell you, get out of that bed right now.
Well, you know what?
In Philadelphia, I spent many days outside the car. Neither hand would work, couldn't work my fingers, and snowing and cold and ice, and she wouldn't open the door. She said, I'm not going to open your door the rest of your life. And people look at it like she's the meanest thing in the world.
My mother thought, who did I raise?
I opened the door for her now because she made me do it then, and same thing with feeding myself and everything else. She's tough love, I guarantee you.
Tell me this. Cleve, one of the things that you state in the book is that the Marines' vow is any mission assigned will be accomplished in a superior manner no matter what the obstacles. Now, how have you taken, obviously, that's your life and that's your testimony of Vietnam. How have you taken that mission and applied it beyond the military and family and in all that you do today?
I think in the family life and all, it's just a leadership, and we used to kneel by our daughters' beds when they were in the cribs and pray with them and just dedicate them to the Lord, and then having Bible study and prayer with them, and we've read 5 Psalms a day and 1 proverb a day their whole life, and they do it too, and every 31 days we get through 150 Psalms and 31 Proverbs, and I think just having a goal and a mission and go after it and accomplish it.
You state that USMC doesn't mean the same thing it does for a lot of other people, that you state that it says United States Marine for Christ. Now, tell me about at what point did Christ and the Lordship of Jesus, you guys have been used so much by the Lord to impact so many thousands of lives. At what point did your life really change and where you say, all right, Christ, I am yours and I'm committed to you?
Well, Larry, if I'd have died on that hilltop and I missed it about a half a heartbeat, I'd be in hell for eternity right now. I've been in church all my life and didn't drink, didn't smoke, had good character, good morals. A lot of down and outers. You hear about drug addicts and alcoholics and all that turning. I wasn't down and out. I was up and outer. But I still needed the Lord. And I came home one night, went out to see Bobby Richardson and Miss America and a Preacher Billy Zioli got up and brought a message. He said that you're a fool for Christ or a fool for others. He said, whose fool are you? And I knew that night whose fool I'd been. And Deanna was the same way. Good moral, good character, and so forth. We were virgins when we got married, always been faithful and true to each other. But we needed Jesus. And we came forward at that service out at a crusade and knelt and prayed, confessed our sins, and invited the Lord Jesus to come dwell in our hearts. And we hadn't gotten over it. It hadn't been the same since. And we've been sharing him ever since.
Wow. To God be the glory. That is great. One of the things that Deanna, you say, and by the way, Cleve and Deanna speak literally all over, not just the United States, all over the world, obviously. But one of the YouTube videos that I was watching of you speaking at a convention, Deanna, you said, the problem, and correct me if the quote is wrong, but you said the problem today is with commitment is that people value convenience more than they do commitment.
Exactly.
Talk to me about that.
Well, it's just true. I mean, I tell young women today as we're speaking, when they see any military man come in, like this young man, stand up, Sergeant, would you please? Stand up there. Now turn around, look at that uniform. When a Marine walks in or any man in uniform, the women just swoon. I literally have to... I have to put a guardrail around our marriage to keep him away from my husband even now. Thank you so much.
You can sit down now.
But it's so amazing. This is what is so beautiful. These uniforms just, the young girls just literally, they just faint almost. They're just so fascinated. But I tell them,
what size is your jacket?
Lord, forgive this pastor for saying that, please.
My wife's here. I want her to swoon.
Okay, well, she swoons. She swoons. All right, listen. So I think it's so important for them to realize those uniforms are going to come back from war, not always the same.
Yes.
There's going to be a limb missing,
That's
perhaps 2 or 3. And I want them to realize that when they marry a military person, that they need to realize that that's the commitment. They need to say, I have that commitment up front. Instead of looking for a perfect 10 and it being a downhill slide from there, realize whether they come back, one arm, no arms, because a lot of these young men and women coming back from Iraq right now are limbless. There's not a single limb left, and we've seen them in San Antonio, and many of those are Marines fighting to become independent once again, because that's the kind of man I knew. He didn't want me taking care of him the rest of his life. He wanted to take care of me.
Yes.
And I wanted to do my part to get my independent man once again where he could take care of himself. Because none of these Marines will ever see themselves as handicapped.
Yes.
Challenged, yes, never handicapped. And they're determined, and that's what a wife should be, determined to do what we have to do at the time they need us to do it, but then to know when to step back and to allow them to do the things that they are able to do. He took the word can't out of his vocabulary. He really did, because he is unable to do certain things with 2 fingers that work. And I remember when they literally opened this hand up to give him a hand. It was all burned flesh, and when he threw his hands up, the metal all was caught into this hand, and it saved his one eye.
Wow.
So he had the hand opened up, this finger was replaced. Dr. Sig Sanson literally took a tendon out of his leg, put it in his middle finger to give him one more finger on that hand that would work.
Praise God.
And that graft died. I mean, Cleve really has no control. It's a dead finger there. He told the doc to get it off. He said, well, Cleve, for cosmetic purposes, let's leave it. But I mean, Cleve said, Doc, quit crying over the middle finger, get my trigger finger working so I can shoot another dove. I mean, that's the Marines. Is that not right? It's a Marines mentality.
Yeah.
Just get my trigger finger working. Yeah. And that's what works.
Yeah.
But you know, we have had to learn to adjust and learn to laugh. Yeah. And I remember when I was putting this eye in, when he wore an eye, but he has no muscle control, so I love the patch. And he started, I think, this debonair look around the country, shaven head and patch. But when I had to put the conformer in to keep his eye socket open, I got a big nipple. It was a huge nipple. I mean, we've come a long way from the archaic things that we had then to the modern, but it had this big, huge nipple protruding out of his head, and I couldn't get it to come off, so I fell on the floor laughing right as all the docs walked in, and they saw me on the floor, Cleve with this big nipple out of his head, and they shook their heads like, they'll never make it. But what is Proverbs 17:22 says, a merry heart doeth good like medicine.
Yeah.
So we have had to laugh at some things.
That's
we
right.
really have.
Tell me about your girls.
We've been blessed with 2. Tara has got twins, 8 years old, and Daniel and Caroline. Daniel, we found 2.5 years ago, has leukemia, and we're going through that right now, but he's putting up a real fight. And Krista has got twins, 10 years old, so we're blessed with daughters and 2 sets of twins. So.
And I would like for people to pray for Daniel, because at 6 he was diagnosed. At 8 we just took him to Paris Island because he thought since his hair came out that God had called him to be a Marine. I mean, he really did. He thinks all Marines have no hair. So we took him to Paris Island. He stood there in his little camos, and I told the young men going through boot camp, I said, I know it's hard right now going through the crucible. A lot of them wanted to quit. I said, but every day I want you to look at this little guy. When you're in combat, you're training to face the enemy. He faces the enemy of leukemia every day, and he wants to be a Marine one day, and he knows God is in control of his life.
That's a great word. Cleve, next week, our church every year annually has a huge patriotic celebration, and this place will be standing room only, and Marines will be rappelling from the ceiling, and indoor fireworks will be going off, and great music. And how important is that? It seems like today in America, a lot of people are shying away from patriotism again, and almost apologizing for it. As a matter of fact, next week in my message, the title of the message is "What is Right with America?" And to take a look and revisit some of the things that our founding fathers gave us and why this is a great nation. How important is it for us, especially as Christians, to continue to try to make this a great nation that would be a light unto the hill for the Lord?
Well, I appreciate churches that take a stand like this. You'd be surprised the churches that go in, you can't even find an American flag or a Christian flag like y'all have displayed. But just to have it recognizing the World War II veterans in Korea and Vietnam and Persian Gulf and folks that are serving today, we appreciate it so very, very much in churches like this that have that kind of celebration. And a lot of churches aren't doing it, and we thank you for doing it, I guarantee you.
One of the things that I'll never forget, John, you remember this, was it the 25th anniversary of the Vietnam War? And in our patriotic celebration on that particular Sunday, I asked for all of the men who had served in Vietnam to come. And I told them, I said, I want to apologize to you because when you came home, I grew up at that time. I was a freshman in college and saw the same things you saw on our campuses. And I said, when you came home, I remember people spitting on soldiers. And I just want to say I'm sorry. And I want us to give you the hero's welcome that you didn't get 25 years ago. And Cleve, as God is my witness, I saw this lined up with men and women, and a couple of guys literally turned their back on the audience, were weeping so hard and crying. And I never realized, how difficult that must have been for you guys in that particular war, not to be able to come back to the real hero's welcome you deserve.
There's so many of them that when you do things like that, that's the first time they've ever been recognized, and they really appreciate it. But let me tell you, Vietnam veterans today are really reaching out to the wounded warriors. These come back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and the support they're giving, the work they're doing, it's unbelievable. We're all over the country with them and just see what they're doing to help families, build them a house, get them a job, help them anywhere in their career they can, and just help them get their feet out. So it's giving Vietnam veterans a chance to give back, and I guess give to these veterans coming back, what we didn't have. I was going through a major airport one day, and I was trying to pick up a couple bags, and a guy came over and picked up a bag, started taking it out to the car, and he looked at me, and he said, "What happened to you?" I said, "Car wreck?" I said, "No, Vietnam." He threw my bag down, so serves you right. And so, that's what a lot of us got then.
Well, I'm going to tell you, this is amazing. And they do get choked up, and I get choked up too, because you just opened a real wound with the Vietnam veterans and thank the Lord because of this war right now. I do believe the Vietnam veterans, are finding healing as they reach out because they recognize what these young men and women are going through. For instance, Cleveland and I were in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, before we were going to speak to 650 combat Vietnam veterans. And I just know God orchestrated this. I know it. We sat there in Cracker Barrel. As we walked in, this manager came over, and Cleve had gone to the men's room, and he said, "Ma'am, I hope I'm not going to offend you, but what happened to your husband?" I said, "Oh, my husband gave his arm and eye in Vietnam to help the Vietnamese people to know liberation and freedom." And he just said, "Well, ma'am, if you don't mind, I would like to buy your breakfast today." I said, "Oh, you certainly don't have to do that." He said, "You don't understand. I am from Vietnam." And he said, "I thank God for men like your husband." He said, "Because I wouldn't be a manager today of Cracker Barrel had it not been for men like your husband." He said, "And my son is graduating from medical school as a neurosurgeon thanks to men like that." And that night when we spoke for the combat Vietnam veterans, God had that on my heart. I shared that, and 650 Vietnam veterans said, "That's why we were there, and our country will never." I would like to have that manager on national television sharing that story so every Vietnam veteran could hear the real truth of why they were there, because that was in their hearts.
That's a great word. That's a great word.